Hello guys, hopefully you're all doing well. I know it's been a little while since the last video, but I want to cover in this video something that I get a lot of questions about, and it's a fairly inexpensive, relatively lower cost section of your bow hunting or archery equipment, and that is fletching. Which one is the best? Which one to use? How do you pick them? All those things. I'm going to go over some of those fundamentals in this video, so stay with us. As with all my videos, these things are just purely suggestions based off of some of my personal experience and about 20 plus years of bow hunting and archery. And you know, whatever's working for you, if you're having fun with it, by all means, keep doing that and don't listen to anything I say. But if you're looking for a second opinion and maybe a different take on some of these things, here's mine, and maybe it might just, you know, give you a few suggestions for things you can try with your setup or with your bow hunting. I think the best place to start with this fletching lesson or this fletching video is to think about the fundamentals of fletching and what that means for archery and what we're trying to do. And to use that, I'll just use one of the most popular vanes out there. This is the Blazer vane. It's on one of my hunting arrow shafts that I've tested with. So I've got a whole bunch of hunting shafts, and you can probably see back there, and that's probably not even 10% of the arrows I have lying around. But basically I take all my hunting shafts and I fletch them in all kinds of different fletching, and I shoot them all downrange and I see which one works best. So before I say anything, I would say the best way to figure anything out, whether it's bow hunting or equipment or whatever it is to literally just go out and try it yourself, see which one works best for you, and go with that, because that's personal confidence in the equipment that you've tested and you've used. So I don't think anything can beat that, no matter what anybody tells you. But some of the basic fundamentals are, when we're launching an arrow, the reason why we have fletching on the back of the arrow is because we don't want the front of the arrow to steer the arrow. We want to create enough drag on the back of the shaft to keep the back of the shaft sort of, try to illustrate here, sort of in line with the front. And what happens is, when we're shooting a bow, we're human. Bows aren't perfect, strings are flexible, all these things. When we're shooting a bow, it doesn't always shoot it out of the bow the same way all the time. It's not perfect, like to the minute detail every time. Even the best world-class archer in the world doesn't shoot the arrow exactly the same like a machine would all the time. And those little micro differences are going to cause inconsistencies downrange. So how do we fix for that? We fix for that by creating drag on the back of the arrow. So when we fire the arrow and it's maybe cocked a little bit this way, a little bit this way when it leaves the bow, if we create drag on the back of the arrow as it's going through the air, it'll line the back of that arrow up with the front so that the front of the arrow can't plane off. So as long as we keep the back lined up with the front, that's the whole intent of fletching. And if you think of it in that way, it kind of gives you a bit of forgiveness factor, so to speak, as you know, we don't shoot it perfect all the time. The drag in the back there will help us keep this arrow on course and in a straight line. So take that to the flip side. If we don't put enough fletching or enough drag on the back of the arrow, what will happen is those little micro errors as we fire this arrow is going to create little bit micro errors downrange. Those errors will get bigger if we don't have drag on the back of the arrow to stabilize the arrow. So what you'll see is not enough fletching, your groups downrange will open up, especially when you go further distances. Now, there's some little nuance between using too much drag and shooting long range, which may be a little too advanced for this video, but just talking about the pure fundamentals here, that's the idea. So if I had to give a beginner or somebody who hasn't really played with this yet but is wanting to delve in this idea of, you know, testing your fletching and trying different fletching for your bow hunting needs or your archery needs, is to really go with a little more fletching than you think you need at first. It does depend how far you're shooting. When you're shooting long range, that's very advanced, you know, we're talking 80, 90, 100 plus yards kind of stuff. Then you have to consider maybe too much fletching is not such a good thing. However, for most practical ranges, maybe 60 yards and under, where most bow hunters and archers are probably shooting, maybe go with a little more vane than you need. Now, this is a pretty popular Blazer vane. I'll talk about the differences in the vanes coming up, but that's basic fundamentals, and then we can get into some more specifics. Now, we kind of talked about what the back of the arrow is doing and how that relates to stability of the arrow and picking the fletching for some drag effect. I want to talk about probably the most basic thing, and this is going to be tailored to the bow hunter here, is what's on the front of your arrow. So if you've got a broadhead on the front of the arrow like this with blade surface, actually let me use a different example. This is a fairly modern Slick Trick 100 broadhead. It's a fairly compact fixed blade broadhead. But say you want to use kind of a more older style, like with big exposed blade surface like this Magnus. These blades on the front of the arrow, it literally acts like fletching on the front of the arrow. So if we go back to the beginning where I told you we're not perfect and we launch the arrow in little micro errors, left, right, up, down, whatever that is. If you think about this as fletching, as steering, when we launch them a little bit this way, a little bit this way, it's going to want to steer it in that direction. And the way we correct for that is creating a little more drag in the back. Now, of course, you correct for that by tuning your bow to get it to shoot as straight as possible. Yes, paper tuning, bare shaft tuning, whatever that is. But again, we don't always shoot an arrow exactly perfect off the bow every time, just little micro errors. So those little micro errors, if the front of the arrow has steering, like this blade surface, these blade surface act as like fletching in the front again, it will steer it off in that direction. However, if we create enough drag on the back, we can say it launches off a little bit crooked this way, but it launches off the bow, we get a lot of drag. This drag can pull the back of this arrow in line with the front, so that the front of this arrow cannot plane off and steer in that direction. So that's the basic idea of fletching with a broadhead. Now, when you got a broadhead with exposed blade surface, obviously you're going to have to use a little more fletching than when you just have a field point like this with no blade surface. This has very little steering ability and catching wind as you shoot it, whereas this will have a lot more. And conversely, if you look at target archers that shoot very far, they don't need a whole lot of fletching to steer a point. But if you're a pretty experienced bow hunter and you've been shooting some pretty exposed blade surface, big broadheads like this, you're gonna have a lot of fletching on the back. In this case, I have this is my traditional hunting arrow. This is 4-inch feathers on the back, and these feathers create a lot of drag. Now there's another thing I didn't talk about. If you're a traditional bow hunter or you're someone that releases the string with your fingers, say as we let the string go, your fingers can create inconsistencies with the string of how you let it go. So you can let go maybe a little bit this way, a little bit this way. I'm exaggerating that motion. But when you don't exactly let go straight, which is going to be pretty common with your fingers, it's going to create oscillations in that string as it fires this arrow down the string, and it leaves the string. And when it leaves the bow, it's going to be a little bit micro off here and there. So with fingers, a finger shooter, you're probably going to want more drag than somebody who's using a mechanical release aid, whereas the release aid kind of is a little more consistent in letting the string go. It's not perfect, nothing is perfect, but it's a little more consistent in doing that, so you can get away with a little less fletching there. Now, talking about mechanical release aids, even mechanical release aids and compound bows, a lot of modern compound bows today, they have a lot of let off. So, maybe you got 90% let off or 85% let off or something like that. There's not a whole lot of tension in the string at full draw way back here. So when that string is not very tense, you can easily manipulate the back of that string. And again, just like letting go with fingers, you can create little micro errors in how that string path fires on the bow, which in turn fires the arrow off in a little bit different way. So, in that case, maybe sometimes higher let-off bows, if you're not a very consistent shooter or you're kind of new to archery and your form isn't very consistent, I think beginners will find with a high let-off bow, although it feels great, they may not be as consistent or have as good a groups down range as if maybe they had something maybe with a little bit less let-off. That's kind of splitting hairs there, but I wanted to give that fundamental out there because I think it's pretty common. A lot of high let-off bows out there, and people love the feel of those. All right, now moving on to something a little bit less blade surface. I kind of talked about this is a Slick Trick standard 100 grain broadhead. As you can see, it's got a little bit not as tall blades as the Magnus broadhead here. So I got big vanes, big feathers on here, and I got maybe a little smaller vane for my hunting arrow. Not a whole lot different. I think a lot of more popular folks would probably use like a blazer with with a broadhead like this, and it will adequately steer this broadhead. I have shot it downrange before in the past, and I really liked it. But there's another thing about noise I'll talk about later with these. But in this case, yeah, this is a 360 Fletch Vane. I use it to steer my fixed blade slick trick broadhead, and I think if you look at my other videos, in my quiver I do carry both a fixed blade and a mechanical, nowadays a sever broadhead. And yeah, that's a pretty kind of advanced video, having multiple pieces of equipment for different scenarios like that. But getting back to the vanes, yes, I do use a larger vane than probably the typical archer, and I have typical bow hunter, and I have shot this all downrange, and you know, I shot the blazers. I've shot even this. I was using the AAE Max Stealth in this vane, and you know, at that from 60 to 100 yards, I just get a little bit better groups with this little bit bigger Fletch vane. Especially the range is 50 and under, where I typically going to use my fixed blade head. When I shoot far, I'm going to use a mechanical, but on a fixed blade head, well, let's take that back. I'll use a mechanical far here because our animals in Hawaii are small. But if the target is big, say it's like an elk or something like that, of course I'm going to use a fixed blade for my short draw. But I just find that, yeah, that the ranges I typically shoot my fixed blade 50 yards and under, this slightly bigger vane gives me better groups, gives me a little bit more forgiveness and tighter shooting than a, you know, a more smaller vane like the Blazer or even the Max Stealth for me. And the next thing is the mechanical broadhead. This is a Sever 1.7. So you can see for beginner bow hunters that don't know, these are blades that expand out. Hopefully you can kind of see that. Kind of the blade kind of coming out here, but they fold back into the body, typically held by some kind of retention system. And it has a very sleek design. There's, you know, no blade surface sticking out. There's just these deployment tabs here. And in this case, if you look, I can use a far smaller vane to steer this arrow. I have shot this, you know, to 100 yards and probably beyond, and this is adequate steering for this low blade surface. Now, if I were to put this vane on this fixed blade broadhead and I shoot in the same distance, I'm definitely not going to get the same results. It will probably have a little bit wider group. So the convention is, you know, with less blade surface or smaller blades or smaller broadheads, we can get away with a little bit less vane on the back. Now that doesn't mean that I don't use the bigger vanes like for my fixed blade on my mechanical. I do. I actually do shoot the Fletch 360 for everything, for all my arrows, including my mechanical broadhead. But should I choose to want to, in a situation where I'm going to be in an environment with a lot of wind, or I do expect my shots to be farther most of the time, let's say, case in point, it might be like my ibex hunt. You guys can check out that video from 2017 in the New Mexico, Florida mountains. It's a lot of wind there, a lot of variation. In that case, you know, getting away with a little bit smaller vane, that might be something that I want to look at, so I get a little bit surface area for the lateral wind, so the arrow doesn't blow off as much. So that's kind of the advantage with mechanical broadheads, is that you can get away with less. You can kind of create an arrow that's a little bit less affected by environmental factors. However, I will say is because you got smaller vanes and all of that, it does, for a beginner shooter that's not as consistent on their release, it may not be as accurate for a beginner shooter using smaller vanes. And in that case, like at the beginning of the video, I say just go a little bit more vane than you need. And if I had to give you just a convention, so to speak, I would just say, you know, any one of maybe the Fletch 360 or even the Blazer vane would be a good choice for any beginner. And if you can't steer you know, a kind of more modern fixed blade broadhead with either one of these, something else is probably wrong. Under spine arrow, your bow is untuned. Maybe you need to work on your shooting form a little bit, a little more consistent, that kind of thing. But these two are really good choices for any beginner, so you really can't go wrong with these. Now, with so many different types of vane shapes on the market, I kind of wanted to give you guys a guide on how to decide which one has a little more drag, a little bit more steering or stability capabilities than the other. And you know, this is not scientific. This is just my experience, having shot all kinds and kind of seen the results downrange for my setups. Of course, your results may vary, but I've seen, if I had to prioritize what creates stability, what creates steering ability for a vane, number one, I would start with the height of the vane. So when I say height, it's how tall the vane is off the shaft. So like a blazer vane, it is very tall off the shaft. And quite honestly, you know, you could have maybe like a low profile 4-inch vane, which is a lot longer than this, than the height, but it's low profile, maybe half as tall or something like that. And it probably won't steer as well as this vane that is a whole lot taller. Now there's some place there where you got to balance height to length and surface area, but this height really does create a lot of steering ability. I guess it gets it out of the air path of the shaft and up into some undisturbed air to really get some drag there. But yeah, just the height that does a lot of work. Now another thing to consider about height is for some shorter draw archers, I have experience with some type of drop away rests and setups that when the arrow is a little bit, fletch is a little too high off the shaft, you can get vane contact as it's firing because it does stick out too much, and in that case, maybe that's not an option for somebody like that. Or even if the cables on the bow are not pulled out enough, and depending how you orient the arrow, or maybe just different kind of makes and models, you can get fletch contact with the cables and things like that. So a very high profile vane, while it steers a lot, can create some tuning issues with vane contact and things like that. This next thing for stability and steering ability, I would say, is the overall length or the surface area of the vane. So as you can see, this Flex Fletch 360 probably has a bit more surface area than this blazer vane, and as a result, it does steer pretty good. And you know, the convention is that when you go to like maybe indoor target archers, not hunting anymore, but we're only shooting 20 yards, shooting big fat arrows like this, and you need to stabilize them in a short amount of time, you're going to see people using really big vanes on the back to achieve that. So even in the professional target archery world, you'll see large vanes for high stability, kind of being consistent with the convention with that. And then, you know, long range kind of shooting, you'll see the vanes shrink down for a little bit less drag. Sometimes too much drag at way out distance can create some instability in the arrow when it's trying to decrease in velocity too fast. But that's a little bit more advanced. But anyway, I did want to cover that. All right. So all that said, the last thing I want to cover is noise. When you fire the arrow through the air, how noisy is it? Probably doesn't matter much for the target archer, but I think it matters a lot for the bow hunter. And if you're a bow hunter, now it depends on the species that you're hunting, but if you're a bow hunter and you're hunting very jumpy animals, say in Hawaii like axis deer, or maybe in the mainland like white-tailed deer, very skittish, jumpy animals, even people might not believe this, but even pigs, I have seen duck arrows here in Hawaii, because pigs are very their eyes aren't so good, but they're very sensitive with their nose and their hearing, and they use it a lot. So, you know, those kinds of animals. Again, deer is quite similar. Axis deer, their eyes aren't super good as like a sheep or goat, but they use a lot of their nose and their hearing. So, because they're so wound up on that, you know, an arrow flying through the air can kind of trigger them to duck or turn away or try to move out of the arrow's path. So, if you've got a quite noisy arrow, this can be an issue for bow hunting, and you can get what they call string jumping or ducking or things like that. Now, it's just been, again, non-scientific, but I have done some videos, you guys can search for them, about vane noise, and I actually shot past the camera, shooting at 100 yards, but shooting past the camera at 50 yards, so kind of getting rid of the sound of the bow, because the bow is farther away, say 40, 50 yards away, and you literally hear the vanes passing the camera, and you can hear some differences in the volume or the type of sound that it makes. And it's just been my experience that if I had to kind of, again, prioritize or put in a level what creates the most noise in a vane, number one is how tall the vane is. So how tall the vane comes off of the shaft, in this case like a blazer, I think it's like 0.56 inches off the shaft or something like that. That height creates a lot of noise. Even if you were to get a different kind of shape, maybe like this Pro Max, I think AAE also makes the Max Hunter, which is similar to a blazer height, even though the shape is slightly different. It does create a ton of noise flying through the air downrange relative to the other types of vanes. So number one, I would say how tall the vane is one of the considerations for noise. The next thing is the shape of the vane. So in the case of the Blazer, you have a very steep leading edge and kind of a sharp point at the top of this vane. And it's just been my experience, and I actually have done this where I kind of rounded off this point on the top, and it does make the vane slightly quieter, but the steep leading edge does contribute to a lot of noise. Conversely, if you look at like my Fletch 360, it's a little bit more sloping shape, more parabolic shape, and it is far less noisy than the Blazer flying through the air. And part of the reason why I like shooting these Fletch, it also a little bit less noisy, and it just so happens I do get a little bit better groups down range with it. Okay, before I forget about this, there's one more thing I wanted to talk about, and that was the helical or the twist rate of the Fletch. A lot of people are pretty hung up on what helical, what degree we need to use, or what angle straight or whatever. So it's just been my experience. Of course, the results may vary. That I've shot straight in my early archery shooting when I was a kid, and then kind of playing with just simple offset with the jigs that we had at the time. And yes, creating some spin is a little bit better than just shooting them straight. So I would say definitely create some offset or helical on your Fletch. But how much helical should you use? I think you can kind of search around on YouTube and you can see some pretty prominent guys that are using a ton of helical, prominent hunters using a ton of helical on their arrows. And then if you kind of go maybe toward the professional archers and stuff like that do bow hunting, you look at what they're using, it's probably not as much helical. So I would say, and this has just been my testing, I have tested things from about 4-degree helical. It just depends, you know, how much you can wrap around the shaft with the vane or the jig that you have. Of course, a skinnier shaft, it's a little bit more difficult to get contact when you're making the arrows. But it's just been my testing that about 2 to 2.5 degree of helical has been the best for me. And kind of with Fletch 360, what that looks like, hopefully this will focus for everybody. Let me try to get that here so you can kind of see the angle there. Of course, with and then maybe with the Max Stealth, kind of a pretty popular vane, you can kind of see what that looks like on the Max Stealth. You know, of course, with the longer vane, same degree, it does wrap around the shaft a little bit more, you know, if it's the same diameter shaft. So you see a little bit more angle with this Fletch, even though it's the identical jig that makes it. So 2 to 2.5 degrees is kind of where I like it. When I've shot a lot of helical in my testing, 0 to 60 yards, I don't really see a difference, but at 80 yards and beyond is kind of where I begin to see some drop. Now, this is splitting hairs here, but I would say at 80 yards, I've done it with this vane, with the Max Stealth. When I put as much helical as I can on it, say that's about 4 degree or something like that, and then I shoot a 2 or 2.5 degree, which is what I typically shoot them at 80 and 100. At about, let me pick the middle, about 90 yards, I'll see probably about this much drop. So what is that, 4 to 5 inches or something like that. And that's just my anecdotal experience with my setup and my speed. So yeah, and I don't really gain in accuracy or consistent tighter groups. So it kind of seemed like a wash for me to just add more helical, lose a little bit of trajectory, but not see any tighter groups or even be able to shoot a fixed blade broadhead any better or something like that. So those are some considerations. Again, 2 to 2.5 degrees is what I use. If I had to make one suggestion for anybody, newer bow hunter out there that doesn't want to mess with all that or time and playing and tinkering around, I think that's a good place to start and stick with. Now, all of that said, hopefully that gives you a little bit direction, a few suggestions on maybe your next fletching choice. And again, I reiterate, just get them all. I mean, if you've got the resources and the time, just get them all and shoot them all and see how they work downrange for the broadheads or for the point that you're using up front or the arrow setup that you have. But again, yeah, if I had to make a quick, just basic, what should everybody use? If you had to just pick real fast for the bow hunter, new bow hunter, yeah, Blazer, Fletch 360. Love these two vanes. Pretty good choices. Even the AAE, the Max Stealth here. This one is kind of spinning here. But anyway, that's the video. Hopefully that's enough for you guys to go with, and catch you guys in the next one. Aloha.